That or bumping up the intensity. We dose 75 minutes of vigorous jogging as opposed to walking. You get a 2-for-1. Seems to count the same. And in kids, we look for them to do 60 minutes a day, and at least half of that should be a vigorous intensity. We also know that exercise has a really interesting dose-response curve, and that really the greatest benefit is getting somebody who is sedentary to just doing moderate amounts of physical activity. Now, to be sure, if you go from being moderately active to highly active, you get more benefit, but the curve starts to flatten out. And so really it's getting this group doing nothing to just little bits of activity. We know that that's very important. So I think all of us would agree that exercise is a medication. We should be prescribing it to patients. I think we know that any medication has a therapeutic range, right? There's a suboptimal dose, what would be considered sort of an optimal therapeutic range, and then what about a toxic level? It would make sense if it's our medicine, we ought to think about correctly dosing it. And for me, the default exercise prescription is walking, and probably the second most common is jogging or running that I would advise patients to do. And these are certainly the types of exercise that we have the most data on. Patients who do regular walking or running, what does the evidence suggest is the best dosing range that we should be prescribing exercise? Let's start with our runners. And there were 2 studies in 2014 that to me really sort of influenced my thinking on the question of what is the optimal dose. The first study was done by D.C. Lee, and most of the data that we have really is on walking. And so D.C., this was one of the first studies that really took a good look at running. He looked at the association of running with all-cause and cardiovascular mortality in over 55,000 adults. And again, this was part of that same database that Steve Blair put together, the Aerobic Center Longitudinal Study data set. And he looked at adults, their age ranged from 18 to 100 years. The mean age was 44 years of age. And he looked at 5 quintiles of distance in terms of miles per week, frequency, the number of times per week they ran, the amount of met minutes per week, and the speed at which they run. He also looked at the effects of changing in running status, and there was a cohort in this study group of over 20,000 patients who had at least 2 visits, so they could compare their running routine at the first visit to that of the second visit and see if it changed, stayed the same, what was the effect on that in terms of mortality. And the data to me is fascinating when you just take it in total, looking again at distance, frequency, amount of running, and speed. And keep in mind that a MET is a measure, the metabolic equivalent of a task is a measure of energy cost of doing a task. And so walking at about 4 miles an hour, which for most of us would be a brisk pace, expends about 5 METs, while jogging at about 6 miles an hour, which is a fairly brisk jog, accounts for about 10 METs. So how many hours or minutes you hold that intensity is what this amount takes into account. And then finally, the speed at which you typically run. And I think what's striking is you look at this, you can all see that there's kind of a sweet spot here. Really, it's that first or maybe second quintile seems to get you the major benefit in terms of all-cause mortality and as well cardiovascular mortality. As you scan across, most of the curves don't keep going down. They start to go flat or even begin to drift upward, this so-called U-shaped curve that we see with exercise. And when you sum them all together, really, to me, the lowest dosage that gives the biggest bang for the buck is just getting you out of that first quintile into the second quintile. We're talking about in the range of 51 minutes per week, less than 6 miles a week, maybe 1 to 2 times per week of running. The total met hours, 506. So we're talking again 50 minutes at a 6 mile per hour jog. It gets you right in the range of where you get the bulk of those benefits. That's not a lot of running. We're talking about 10 minutes a day to go for a jog seems to get you the bulk of the benefits. And if you look at patients, without a doubt, the biggest reason they don't exercise is time. I simply do not have enough time to get the exercise I need, and this to me is a great way to get it. As I mentioned, the second thing that DC looked at was comparing changes in exercise running habits between the first and the second visit. and he sort of used as the standard those who remain non-runners both visits. That is, I'm not doing any running the first visit, not doing any running the second visit, compared to those who became non-runners. That is, the first visit they were running, the second time they came in they were not running, and then the third one was they became runners. The first visit they weren't running, then they started running, and then finally both times they came in they were running. So look at it, not surprisingly, compared to those who never ran, those who were always runners had the lowest mortality, both for cardiovascular and all-cause. But look at what's interesting is those who were, if you were ever a runner during your life, it seemed to give you a lasting immunity to mortality risk in terms of both cardiovascular and all-cause. They were about the same. So number one, if you've done it, great. And number two, it's never too late to start. You seem to be able to get the benefit no matter where you start. So what I conclude from this study is that runners had consistently lower risk of all-cause and cardiovascular disease mortality compared to the non-runners. The striking part of this study, though, is how little you have to do. 39 to 59 minutes per week really gave you the bulk of the benefits. We're talking 5 to 10 minutes a day of a jog gave significant benefits. And obviously staying a runner, keeping it up as long as you can gives the most benefit, but if you can do it for any part of your life, never too late to start. Those are important take-home messages, I think, that I use with patients. Now this study, looking at coronary artery plaque, and Steve kind of went into this in great detail, which is great. This kind of sets the stage for this study by Schwartz, really caught my eye. Published in a sort of an obscure journal in Missouri Medicine, but it was very interesting, got a lot of media attention, because I think most of us would assume that marathon running is good for the health. And in fact, probably 4 decades ago, a noted American cardiologist, Thomas Basler, had promoted this Basler hypothesis that if you ran a marathon, you were immune to coronary artery disease. There was no way you were ever going to get it. Well, this study, like others, has suggested that is just not the case. And this was an observational study comparing coronary calcium scores using a high sensitivity coronary CT angiogram and looked at 2 different groups of men who ranged in age between 56 and 59. So we can call that middle age, right? Early middle age. But the first group was 50 male marathon runners, and this was done actually in Minnesota, in Minneapolis, looking at those who had run the Twin Cities Marathon at least 25 years in a row. So these were people who were doing at least one marathon for 25 years. And so at least 25 marathons over their lifetime. And then they compared that group to a cohort of 23 male sedentary controls who were matched for age, coronary, and other coronary artery disease risk factors. Well, not surprisingly, the control group of sedentary men had higher resting pulse, weight, BMI, along with higher rates of cholesterol, hypertension, and diabetes. All of the things that would make one assume, based on Steve's work as well, that you're going to have higher coronary artery calcium scores. But that's not what they found. They actually found that the male marathon runners had higher total plaque volume. They also had higher incidence of calcified plaque, and more concerning, the non-calcified plaque that's more likely to rupture and cause an acute coronary event. Although the lesions, the lesion area and length, the number of lesions, and the diameter of the stenosis caused by this calcification didn't reach statistical significance. But so it's interesting that despite the fact the runners showed improvements in the traditional risk factors, they had higher coronary calcium scores. Makes one think, what is going on with running? Can this be good for the heart? And that was certainly this message and these graphs showing, this higher risk of non-calcified, especially plaque, was concerning when compared to a group of sedentary controls. So that caught my eye that perhaps, long-term marathon running is not the best thing you can do for your heart. And this study kind of lended credence to various other observational studies that showed at the same time dramatic reductions in mortality when you got somebody to be active and doing some running, but the effects seemed to follow a U-shaped curve. When you got out to the end where you were doing much more running, the risks were higher. In fact, Jim O'Keefe has really done some real seminal work on this, looking at what is the optimal dosage range in runners. And he based on his work and other studies, suggests that in the range of 1 to 2.5 hours at a moderate pace seems to give the optimal benefit in terms of running. When you go beyond 2.5 hours, the curve starts to become U-shaped, and there's a concern, not that you're putting yourself at significant risk, but you're losing some of the benefit. If you're running purely for health benefit, running longer than 2.5 hours a week isn't helping you. You're kind of doing it for reasons other than health. In a similar fashion, 5 to 20 miles, pretty big range, but in that range seems to be the sweet spot for running. When you go beyond 25 miles per week, you begin to lose some of that benefit based on the work of O'Keefe and other studies that he included in that work. Now this kind of goes along with various other studies that you've probably seen in the news. The Copenhagen heart study got a ton of media attention, where they looked at 1,098 healthy joggers, compared them to almost 4,000 healthy non-joggers, followed them over a 12-year period, and again, looking at all-cause mortality, you see the same sort of U-shaped curve. And when you control beyond just age and sex, when you control for sex, or smoking, alcohol, education, diabetes, look at what happened even in this strenuous jogger. This is what got all of the media attention, that actually they were saying that running these extreme endurance amounts actually cause you to die sooner. But you got to look at this. This is based on 2 patients, so it's hard to make a lot out of this, but it does give concern that this U-shaped curve, perhaps we're getting out into an area where we're not helping ourselves. The message that was missed on this, that should have been out in the literature and out certainly in the lay public, was that look what just going from being a sedentary non-jogger to a light jogger, look how much that helped your health. Anybody could probably do that, and that should have really been the take-home from this study. Unfortunately, it became all about this higher risk here. And then we have the so-called UK Million Women study, which was really an amazing study that looked at the effect of 5 different quintiles of strenuous versus any physical activity on the risk of various cardiovascular disease, heart disease, cerebrovascular events, and venous thromboembolism. And it was a huge cohort of 1.1 million women in the range of 50 to 64 that self-reported their data, followed them for 9 years, had huge numbers of adverse events, and was well controlled. And look at, you see that same sort of U-shaped appearance. And again, that same message that just going from that first quintile doing nothing to just a few days a week of exercise really had a powerful effect. And so you could really see sort of in these graphs the sweet spot, or what we call the Goldilocks Zone. That's just about right in terms of how much exercise I need to do. For strenuous exercise, it was doing about 2 to 3 times a week of strenuous exercise. When you did more moderate exercise, maybe 4 to 6 times a week, just walking and things like that. And these are really consistent with our U.S. physical activity guidelines, trying to get patients right in this range. I just think it's important for the messaging to be more on what's the least amount you can do, because we know that you don't have to necessarily be at those guidelines. You don't certainly have to be above them to get these benefits. And we've known that with various other studies. Mossafarian showed this with the risk of AFib, that same U-shaped curve. When you start to talk about athletes doing extreme endurance events, and I do a lot of work with Ironman triathlon, and so I've gotten to know some of these great pro triathletes. A lot of them are suffering with cardiovascular issues. A lot of them have implantable defibrillators, pacemakers, as a result of years and years of extreme endurance exercise. So we have to think about that dose-response curve in a little different way, that perhaps it is U-shaped. But keep in mind, this is not the end of this curve that I'm most worried about as a family physician. This is the group that I'm most worried about. This is where the effort really needs to be placed, not on scaring these patients. It's scaring these patients into getting more active. I'm not so worried here about this group based on the evidence. And are you surprised at this data? I mean, life isn't at all about moderation, right? If 1 glass of wine a day is good, the whole bottle isn't better. We know that with all things. Moderation is the key. I've always been concerned, though, with this idea of athlete's heart. Is that really a healthy adaptation? If I'm in clinic and I see a patient with left ventricular hypertrophy, ECG changes like T-wave inversion, Q-wave, right bundle branch block that's new, or they've got arrhythmias, all the way from bradycardia to junctional to AV block. These are things we see all the time in runners. If they're a non-runner, I'm worried, and suddenly when they're a runner, oh, athlete's heart, go on your merry way, don't worry about it, nothing going on here. That has always concerned me. Beyond that, you know, we pointed this out at Ironman, where we found when athletes were finishing these races, they were having bumps in their troponin and their CPK. That kind of worried me. And Ironman certainly didn't like that getting out there. The headline was Ironman causes heart attacks, but it's got to give you pause when the CPK, the troponin, even the BNP go up after running an extreme endurance event. And beyond that, over time, in a lot of these extreme endurance athletes, we are seeing evidence of myocardial fibrosis, scarring, and potentially dangerous arrhythmias that end up needing a pacemaker or an implantable defibrillator, and perhaps accelerated cardiovascular disease. And this has been referred to as Phidippides cardiomyopathy, and I think we all know the legend of Phidippides. This is how marathon got started, right? The marathon distance was based on Phidippides, the hero of ancient Greece, who ran 26.2 miles from Marathon to Athens to deliver the news of the military victory over the Persians. And it's kind of a concern when, you know, the very first winner of a marathon actually died right at the end of it. That probably should have given us pause. And certainly if you've ever run a marathon, you know at 20 miles you're going, why couldn't Phidippides have died at 20 miles instead of 26.2? So we know, though, that there's more to the story than simply minutes per week of activity. I want to just kind of, in a fun way, to point this out, give you the tale of two male patients. And I want you, based on the evidence I present, I don't think it'd be hard, to predict the heart patient. The first individual is a 5'8" tall, 158-pound man who never drank alcohol, ate mostly a low-fat, high-fiber diet. He was a very active and an avid marathon runner and proponent of physical activity. He had been a former smoker, but he quit and dedicated himself to being fit for the rest of his life. Compared him to the second individual, who also was 5'8" tall, but he weighed 270 pounds. He was a heavy drinker, ate pretty much always a high-fat, low-fiber diet, was unabashedly sedentary, and was a heavy cigarette and cigar smoker. Now, who do you think is the coronary artery disease patient, right? It's got to be this individual here. Let's unmask who these are. Well, the first one is Jim Fixx, who died at the age of 52 while he was out jogging. Patient number 2 is Sir Winston Churchill, who died at the age of 90 at home, probably after consuming a large steak and smoking a cigar and having some brandy, and then probably slowly faded out. So we know there's certainly much more to the story. And if you know about Jim Fixx, who was a famous author, marathon runner, really created the running boom in the 80s with his books on running. But you know, you need to know more about Jim Fixx. His father died at the age of 42 from a heart attack. His brother also died from coronary artery disease. And sometimes, no matter what we do, you can't outrun or even out-medicate your genes in a lot of cases. So certainly there is more to the story. Now, this other idea of the risk of exercise causing a heart attack is out there. And certainly Jim Fixx, whenever you hear the story on the 11 o'clock news, they had the Sacramento Marathon and somebody died, what the hell were they doing? You know, that can't be good for you. What you need to know is that certainly at the time while you're doing intense exercise, you raise your risk of having an MI, probably just a little bit. In somebody who regularly exercises, they have about a 2 to 5-fold increase in the risk of having a heart attack while they're doing the active exercise. While you're out for a run, the risk slightly bumps up for sure. But what you forget is that the rest of the day, the risk is dramatically lower than that sedentary person. What's more concerning, though, is that couch potato who has to run to catch a bus or has to go out and shovel the snow on an icy day. Their risk goes up over 100-fold while they're doing physical activity. That's the group that needs to be worried that I could have an MI while I'm exercising. The person doing it every day is at very low risk. So let's talk about walking now. And with the walkers, really my messaging is around how little can I get away with to get some significant improvements in mortality. And CP Wen did, I think, one of the best studies on this, a huge cohort, over 400,000 Taiwanese adults. He followed them for 8.5 years with activity questionnaires, then he correlated how much walking they were doing with mortality rates. And you can see that compared to the inactive group, those doing 92 minutes a week on average, about 15 minutes a day, reduced their mortality by 14%. They lived on average 3 years longer, and he found in his data that every 15 minutes a day of walking you added reduced mortality by up to about 4%. And it kind of plateaued around 100 minutes per day. And this was both in men and women, so you can see just getting to that group, 15 minutes a day reduced mortality by 14%. And you can see again, the curve flattens out like we've seen in virtually all of these studies. Anything walking beyond 100 minutes a day, you're probably doing it for reasons other than health. I think that's the message, not that it's dangerous, and we really, with moderate to moderate exercise and light exercise, we have not found a U-shaped curve. It just goes flat. There's no evidence of increasing mortality really in a significant fashion. And this again is backed up by the study by Aram on leisure time, physical activity, and mortality. And this is a bit of a confusing side. Again, he's looking at med hours per week and then increasing med hours. And right here in this range is right at the physical activity guidelines of 150 minutes per week. And then you get a little in a bit, if you go up to about 2 times the guidelines, you get a little bit more benefit, but by 3 times the guidelines, the curve is flattening out. You're not getting any more benefit by going beyond. And this was, again, a huge cohort using pooled data from 6 different studies, over 600,000 men and women. They average age 62 years. The messaging, again, being possibly a U-shaped curve, but really the message is just a little bit. Get to the guidelines, or even close, you get great benefit. Now, I love this study for my elderly patients, and every 70-year-old of mine hears about the Grim Reaper study. Certainly, in addition to the amount you watch, the amount you walk, the time you spend, the number of days you do it, the pace that you can walk is a great predictor of mortality. We've known for many years that gait speed correlates with mortality. And so this was a clever group of Australian researchers who wanted to know how fast does the Grim Reaper walk? When am I in danger of being caught by the Grim Reaper? So they took over 1,700 Australian men over the age of 70. They measured their walking speed at a usual pace. They had them walk about 20 feet at what they would consider for them, a brisk pace. And what they found is that the Grim Reaper walks about 2 miles an hour. In this study, none of these 70-year-old men that could walk 3 miles an hour or faster were caught by the Grim Reaper. So don't come ask me if you could be cleared for exercise when you're 70. You need to be cleared. You need to come see me when you can't walk 3 miles an hour or faster. That's because I'm worried then that the Grim Reaper is gaining on you, and we need to speed you up to keep you from dying. So I love this message with my elderly patients and giving them that feedback. And then finally, this recent study in JAMA really caught my eye. And again, it's more of the same messaging, but in this study, they went back 23 years at the Cleveland Clinic and looked at 122,000 adults who had had an exercise treadmill test done. And then they went and correlated that with mortality, and they measured they divided these into 5 quintiles of performance on that exercise stress test. And they termed the top 20% to be elite. Not necessarily they were elite athletes, but they were the highest 20%, then compared to the lowest 20%, and then the middle 3 quintiles in between. And look at the data here in terms of time from the treadmill test and survival probability. That lowest group, look at the dramatic difference. All you got to do is get out of that lowest quintile. There's not much difference between the high fit group and the below average group. What's that joke about the guys are out hiking and they see a bear and they go, oh my God, the bear is coming at us, and the one guy's putting on his running shoes goes, what are you putting your running shoes on? You can't outrun a bear. He goes, I'm not going to outrun the bear. I just got to outrun you, right? So that's all you've got to do is outrun this lowest quintile. Just get out of here and you're going to be fine. And that's a message, again, that I think we've got to emphasize. And what was astounding from this data, look at the comparison of being low fit, being in that lowest quintile with being in the highest quintile. Look at the adjusted hazards ratio for this low fit as compared to things like smoking, coronary artery disease, diabetes, hypertension, even end-stage renal disease is less of a concern than somebody who's in that lowest quintile in terms of mortality. I just find that astounding. I mean, I think of my end-stage renal disease patients as ones who need to start making plans. The ones who need to start making plans are this lowest group on an exercise stress test. So let me summarize. Clearly, to me, exercise is a medicine. It can extend life. Running and walking, two great formulations. Walking to me is sort of the default. Running is often the second one that I prescribe. And like any medicine, I think it's clear that exercise has got an optimal dose range. It's also got a subtherapeutic range, which is pretty darn low, and a toxic range, perhaps. And this is not a highly toxic activity. But running as little as 60 minutes a week, I think we ought to be pushing that kind of amounts, because those are doable for most people. Just get 10 minutes, 6 days a week. I think approaching it that way gives us a better chance of convincing people to do it on a regular basis. Walking 15 minutes, 6 days a week, seems to get you the bulk of the benefits. When you run beyond 2.5 hours or beyond 25 miles, you're not getting any benefit, and perhaps you might be losing some of the benefits gained by doing lesser amounts. Walking anything beyond 100 minutes a day, no evidence that it provides additional health benefits. And I have a concern, albeit not a great one, and let's face it, we all do things that are a bit dangerous. If you love to run and you run, at an extreme endurance level, go into it with an open mind that you're doing it for reasons other than health. And we do things that we enjoy, that help make life worth living, whether it's jumping out of an airplane or climbing Mount Everest. People do physical activity, things that are a bit risky. This is not near that risky, but I think patients should go into it with their eyes wide open. The other messages I think that we need to promote is that there's a lot of great evidence between our U.S. physical activity guidelines. Every time a study comes out, it seems to back that up. That 150 minutes a week is a great goal that virtually, I think, assures you of getting what you need, or doing 75 minutes of vigorous exercise. And I haven't talked about HIIT training, which I find very exciting. We don't have a lot of data out there, but again, the main reason people don't exercise is I don't have enough time. HIIT training allows you to get it maybe in a couple of minutes if you do real high intensity. It's a bit painful, and I worry about injury, but that's another thing that I haven't talked about. But we know a 2-for-1. Just jogging instead of walking, you get a 2-for-1 in terms of the benefit. The message that we've got to take away is the biggest benefit goes from being sedentary to just doing moderate amounts of physical activity. And certainly there is a risk while you're exercising. There is a risk of a cardiovascular event, but it's mainly in those who are naive to this drug called exercise, that are sedentary, suddenly take a big bolus. And I haven't even brushed on the benefits of strength training and flexibility training, especially as we age. And that's a whole other talk I give on itself of the benefits of strength training, because I tell you, all the evidence suggests it's just as good as cardiovascular training for all of these things. We just don't have the bulk of evidence like we do around cardiovascular training. So thanks very much. I'm happy to take questions.
Okay, let's figure this out. So we have an opportunity. I'll just speak loud. We're a small group, so if you need a microphone, use it. If you can just speak loud, that's fine. But for both of our speakers, we'll take it. We'll just go around, and you can ask either Dr. Sidney, Dr. Sallis, the questions that you may have written down, and we'll go from there. Go ahead.
Thank you very much. I'm Melba Hinojosa, and I work for the California Department of Public Health. And my question to you is, at the very beginning, there was a prescription pad with, like exercise. And then I've also heard of prescriptions of even just going to a park or an open space. So I just wondered if you do that in your practice as well.
I do, and we actually, Kaiser, we ended up, George Howerson, when he was our CEO, really just he loved this kind of work and started this campaign called America Walk, to campaign to get America walking, and everybody walk actually. And with that, we made prescription pads that I use in my office, and I frequently just tear those off. Here's what I'm putting you on for your blood pressure, your diabetes, you're pre-diabetic. I want to start you on this. And I tell the patients, this isn't the only, I use medications obviously, but I always start with walking 30 minutes 5 days a week and give that a chance to see if you don't need a medication. And I love tearing off a prescription pad with walk, and I put 30 minutes 5 days a week.